David. 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 Welcome to the David Wells Experiment. I am your host, David Wells, and we're going to talk about video games and stuff. I've said before that it's not going to just be about that, but looking at the statistics, that seems to be what people tend to engage with. Anyway, so I was looking at my video and the one about I was looking at the statistics, and apparently the podcast I did that had Super Nintendo in the title did pretty well. Now, I think I've said it before, but growing up, we didn't really have a console system in our house like just about every other kid. I remember we'd visit other people's houses and, they'd have like a system, even if it was like an NES, like they'd have something. And eventually we did get some sort of video game system. I think I must have been like 11 or 12 when we did. But anyway, yeah, the first like home console system we got was a PlayStation. And I think maybe a year or two before, I got a Game Boy Pocket. And those are kind of two of my favorite Christmas gifts ever. I got the Game Boy Pocket for Christmas, I want to say 98, 97. Um, all the kids in my family together got the PlayStation as sort of a group present. So no one could say, it's mine. Although really, so funny story about how we got it. So I'd always had in mind to ask for a PlayStation 1 for Christmas or something from our grandparents. It's always grandparents that get you this stuff. I think aside from my dad not liking video games, he thought they would distract us. Um, yeah, he didn't like them, and so we almost got though an Atari and like a 2600 in the 90s. So I remember I was trying to figure out how to put it to the TV, and I'm looking at the games and I'm thinking like, you know what? I know it's a video game system, but I don't think I want it. The games just didn't look very fun. Now I've done research of the Atari, and I think there probably were some fun games on it produced in its lifetime, but I don't think I saw any of them. It didn't look like the fun I had playing the NES or the Super NES or any other system I had seen. Anyway, so back to the PlayStation. So funny story about how we got that. Um, so the way I wanted the PlayStation was there was a Target on Waltham in San Antonio, and they had two video game systems that you could check out, the Sega Saturn and the PlayStation. Now, the difference between the two was the Sega Saturn didn't have any games you could play. You would just click on a title and it would show you like video footage of the games. It wouldn't actually show you the game itself. Or if it did have games you could try, they weren't the ones that caught my attention. The PlayStation, on the other hand, there was a fair amount of, demos you could play and decide like, okay, I like this game. And there were all kinds, from racing to platformers. I think there might have been a couple RPG demos. Anyway, yeah, so there was a lot going on, and I distinctly remember Crash Bandicoot. I can't remember if I've repeated this in a past episode, but that's how I decided. And also, when I would look through game magazines and look through the kinds of games that I wanted, the PlayStation seemed to have the ones that caught my attention. So, fast forward to around Christmas, and my grandparents call us up at our house. I'm like, so it's called the PlayStation, right? And that's the one you want? I'm like, yeah. I'm like, well, let me ask everybody else's opinion. So I decided to make this a democracy because I thought that everybody would agree with me. I was like, hey, what do we want? The PlayStation or the N64? Everyone else said N64. I'm like, shoot, I really want the PlayStation. So I think for a second, and then I go, yeah, we all want the PlayStation. And I think one of my siblings was like, hey, we didn't say that. But it was too late. They already heard it, and we got a PlayStation for Christmas. But I told this to my brother, and he's like, yeah, in retrospect, we had a lot of fun with it, so I don't regret it. And I can distinctly remember getting the Game Boy, or like telling my grandparents about wanting the Game Boy for Christmas. And this is about a year before the Game Boy Color came out. Anyway, what happened is I think it was at church or something, and I just had a copy of like a Toys R Us magazine or some sort of advertisement. And I said, this is what I want for Christmas. And I pointed it to him. I can't remember if I gave it to him or not, but yeah. And I remember genuinely freaking out when I got it. So the funny thing about the Game Boy is that by the time I got it, the system was already like a decade old. And it wasn't as though it was the most advanced system ever for a handheld. Even when the Game Boy debuted in like 1989, it was the technology was substandard even for that time. Like other companies had portable systems that outpaced the Game Boy dramatically. They had color, they had backlit screens. There was the Atari Lynx, there was the Sega Nomad, and I think the TurboGrafx Express, I forget exactly. Anyway, these machines all had vastly better looking graphics, and they were all in color. Now, the one thing that they didn't have was long battery life. Those things just drained batteries. You could have 6 AA batteries in one of them, and they would just die in 6 hours. The Game Boy, on the other hand, you could put 4 AA batteries in there and you get like 30 hours. So that's a lot of money that parents don't have to spend on batteries. What else happens? Oh yeah, most of those systems, the other factor in those systems' failure was the fact that they didn't have great titles. The Game Boy opened up with Super Mario Land and Tetris, which Tetris was taking the world by storm. There's such a crazy story behind Tetris. So the dude who made that game, Alexei Pajitnov, was born in Russia, and he grew up in the Soviet Union in what is often referred to as the Khrushchev thaw, meaning it was a bit after Joseph Stalin, and they're like, hey, all the Stalin stuff he did, not cool. Let's try to move past that. And there was somewhat of an opening to Western media and literature, and his mom was a reporter, so she would take him to film premieres. So he had a curious mind, and he got involved with the earliest efforts in computers. And he actually designed the first game of Tetris on 20-year-old computers of that time. Basically, when he got that computer, it was revolutionary for Russia, but it wasn't revolutionary for the country that it came from. I think it was from like Finland or one of those northern European countries. It was seriously outdated. I don't believe it had any graphics, software, or hardware to speak of. But somehow this dude was so he knew the inner workings of a computer so well that he found out a way to make a video game on it when it shouldn't have been able to. And it wound up going viral in a pre-internet age around campuses in the Soviet Union. And eventually it got the attention of Nintendo. I'm shortening the story for brevity, but and there was this fierce bidding war between like Nintendo and another company, and Nintendo believed so much in it that they went through the bureaucracy of the Soviet Union to be able to license the game for the Game Boy, and they won. Now, their original plan was to ship the Game Boy with Super Mario Land because because platformers are accessible and Mario was their guy. He's their Mickey Mouse. So they figure, oh, let's ship it with that. Because back then, systems came with a free game usually. But instead of that, they decided to bundle it with Tetris because they figure Tetris is a game that could appeal to adults and in addition to kids, it could appeal to the bored businessmen. Whereas if we just ship it with Mario, it might just be perceived as a kid's toy. So that was a good move on their part. And so the guy who invented the Game Boy, his name was Gunpei Yokoi, and his idea was let's use technology that's been around for a bit, but in an innovative way. So the processing chip that they used for the Game Boy was not too dissimilar from, I think, the Zilog Z80 microprocessor, which is the chip that had been used it had been around since the 70s, or yeah, and it was used in calculators. So already it had an architecture that lent itself to being portable and not consuming a lot of power. I think that was their rationale. Gunpei Yokoi was even asked at one point, "Hey, there's competitors coming up with like their own system. Should we be worried?" And he's like, "Are they in color?" And they're like, "Yeah, we should be worried about anything," because he knew that that was going to consume a lot. It's funny, even Nintendo, they almost came up with a successor to the Game Boy in the mid 90s. I think it was called Project Atlantis. Maybe. I feel like I'm mixing some. That might be the N64 I'm mixing it up with. But at this moment, I could swear that it was the Game Boy's successor. But they decided not to. And as sort of a stopgap measure, they decided to create the Game Boy Color. I think that came out in 98 or 99. And then in like 2001, then they finally came up with the Game Boy Advance, which was supposed to have power akin to, say, the Super Nintendo, which had come out about a decade earlier. They knew it was going to take a second to advanced handheld gaming to where they could consistently deliver something that was fun and, profitable. So while a lot of systems, so these days the average lifespan of a console system is about 7 years. It used to be 5, and if they thought they could get some more life out of it, they would push it for 7. But today's 7 is the general consensus of like, okay, that's its lifespan. Anything past that is sort of, they're dragging it out. But I have a theory that the current generation of console systems with like the Switch and the Xbox and the PS5, I think they're going to have a longer lifespan than normal, that even longer than 7 years. My reasoning behind that is the PS5 and Xbox were launched in 2000. Oh wait, they were launched in 2020. The Switch in about it was 2017. So I think they're with the Switch. I think they're going to do something similar to what they did with the Nintendo DS. They'll like release an improved version, but it's not going to be so radical a departure from the design of the Switch that you'll have to call it a different system. You'll probably still have access to all the online features in the online store. There'll still be a Switch, just a more powerful one. Now, with PlayStation and Xbox, I think they're going to push it for. I say we get a new system in 2030 from those companies. Number one, because both the PS5 and the Xbox, their latest system, I don't even know what it's called. That's how disinterested I am in Xbox. I don't even know what the name of their current system is. I just know it's an Xbox. Anyway, they launched their machines in 2020, and we all know what happened in 2020. There were chip shortages, and it was so hard to get a hold of those machines. And even now, there are some chip shortages. So, my bet with their systems is they're going to want to try to milk them for all they're worth. Um, the only thing I could see causing them to adopt a new system on the regular timetable is if, say, the market is so oversaturated with them that, like, if so many people own an Xbox or a PlayStation, that they're like, we got to come up with a new system. We got to give them a reason to buy this. I could see that being the thing that pushes them. But also, I do think they want to get their money's worth. And from the very beginning of the PlayStation's debut, they sold their machine at a loss, banking that they would make their money back on the software sold. So, it's going to keep getting cheaper. And so, if software is really where they make their money, and if they don't want to have to come up with an entirely new infrastructure for an entirely new machine, because that's got to be expensive. I'm betting you we don't get the PlayStation 6 and whatever whatever the Xbox's equivalent would be. I do think I think we'll get a new Switch like a lot sooner. Like, honestly, I feel it's one of those things where if it isn't broke, don't fix it. So I think we'll get like some sort of super Switch that'll like maybe play 4K graphics. I don't even really care about 4K. Like, my thing is it's fun to play. You don't need that. I don't know how many people care about that. Plus, it's just one more variable that designers have to worry about. So my bet is we get some sort of Switch upgrade in like 2024, 2025, probably 2024. I think we've already sort of got that with the Switch OLED. Um, but yeah, anyway, that's my prediction on those systems. One thing I'll say before, I kind of wrap it up is I'm really surprised that there were no systems made in the wake of the Game Boy that took a similar approach. Because one thing the Game Boy doesn't get enough credit for is it created entire worlds, and it only had four colors to work with. It had black, white, and two shades of gray. And you look at those games, and they use that limitation so imaginatively that you forget it was just four colors on that screen. I'm really and they did that to keep costs down and because it consumed less power, and they were able to charge a fraction for the Game Boy what other handheld systems were demanding. I'm really surprised that nobody did that with a home console system, that they decided, let's make an economy system for games. But the gaming sphere was so interesting back then. People were always trying to one up things. I really think around the early 90s, there was only one company that tried to do something like, let's create an economy system. I could do a whole video about why certain systems failed and why certain systems didn't, and I probably will at some point. But this episode is going a bit longer than I initially wanted it to. So have an absolutely super day. This has been the David Wells Experiment, and I will see you next time. Bye.